Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. It's often said that setting is itself a character in fiction, and best-selling author Fiona Davis has brilliantly carved out a niche throughout her career and catalog, co-starring many of New York City's most historic and storied buildings as co-stars in her novels, beginning with The Dollhouse, her debut, which took the book world by storm in 2015 when People magazine made it their official book of the week and guaranteeing readers that upon discovering a debut rich in both twists and period detail, this tale of big city ambition is impossible to put down. Readers knew they were at the right place when her follow-up hit The Address, where Redbook offered that if you've ever been to New York City, chances are your walk through the Upper West Side led to an acute fascination with one of its most famous buildings, the Dakota. This is the novel that dives into all the secrets, madness, and mystery surrounding this esteemed residence. Fiona Davis again proves she's the master of the unputdownable novel. The masterpiece would equally dazzle readers and critics alike, noting that it continues a winning formula that showcases the stories behind New York City landmarks, a hard-to-resist and timely reminder. Far too long, the work done by women has been dismissed and disrespected. Within the pages of her next bestseller, The Chelsea Girls, the Associated Press celebrated her continued tradition of giving juicy supporting roles to New York landmarks, using Chelsea as a metaphor for the grandeur that was within reach but spirals into a much darker place. Oprah Winfrey's O magazine would celebrate her next hit, The Lions of Fifth Avenue, as a book written for book lovers, while the instant New York Times bestseller The Magnolia Palace inspired the Historical Novel Society with the way the pages breeze by as potential romances develop, maybe not the ones you'd expect, and a mystery involving the whereabouts of the Magnolia Diamond unfolds. Deeper issues also undergird both, which confront stereotypes about models and explore how a tragedy can warp family relationships years later. The two narratives dovetail in a satisfying way. Mystery and art lovers should relish this exciting escape into New York's past. She's here today to take viewers on an exciting tour through a process in action. Fiona, welcome and thanks for being here. You became a New York Broadway actress before becoming a New York Times bestseller. Do you remember making up imaginary characters as a child? And any books you read whose personalities on the page equally captured your curiosity?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I hadn't thought about it that way. I think about, okay, these were the early books that I read, but in terms of forming stories in my head, I was definitely a strange kid where I could just hang in my room all day and with my dolls and, things, create stories. And my brother had this great train set with, a whole town. And it was all about the narrative of what was going on in the town. And I really hadn't thought of that until you said that. But yeah, because when I was growing up, there were no other distractions. There was very little TV. There were only three channels. And so if you wanted to have an interesting life, it was all in your head and it was all up to you.
For many of your peers who moved around a lot as children or grew up in one town or city, the local library was always a reliable refuge. Did you find yourself spending a lot of time there growing up?
We moved around a lot, and so we'd always go to the library in every town that we were living in. But I didn't necessarily get to know the librarians. It was more of just this self-guided tour of, okay, the Little House on the Prairie books and where the red fern grows and finding these books that just were so emotional to read. And I think helped ground me when I was in a new situation and didn't quite know where I stood.
What about as you got into high school, as you were discovering your talent for writing words, as you were developing yours at the same time for acting them out in plays on stage?
No, absolutely not. In fact, I didn't have any inkling of wanting to write a book. I loved reading them. I loved acting in plays. I loved the English lit course and the teacher that I had there. I loved our Shakespeare teacher. It was, that I found really compelling, but I couldn't imagine writing a whole book, making something up from nothing and creating a book out of it. And it seemed impossible to me. So I didn't even attempt it, to be honest. And I know a lot of writers say, oh, right, I, wrote my first story in third grade. No way. I wrote essays for school that I had to, but I never imagined I could make something up.
So after graduating college, you made the same sojourn to the Big Apple that so many actors, actresses, and writers do and spent over 10 years working in New York on and off Broadway, playing characters of all types in productions where we have to imagine you honed a razor-sharp instinct for character and story development. Just a whole set of skills over reading and acting so many scripts over the years. I have to imagine you draw on years later in your career as a best-selling novelist.
Absolutely. And, I had a great time. I acted for about 10 years doing Broadway and off Broadway and regional theater. It was great. I worked with some of my best friends who are still my best friends today in terms of mounting a show and producing it and, getting it up and running. It was a great experience. And definitely, when you're acting, you're looking for a character. You're trying to create a character who has a very, you can think inside you, okay, well, this character feels that or feels that, but you have to find a way to express it, either physically, what are they doing in the scene? Where are they standing? How are they standing? What are they fiddling with? And that helped so much when it came to creating a scene with characters in it, because it meant that I wasn't just having a character say, well, I think this. You had to show how he feels, by the way he's sitting or where he's crossing, when he's crossing the stage. All those little decisions make a dynamic scene. And so there's no question that helped. And reading dialogue, and where a playwright can't rely on anything to illuminate what's going on other than what these people are saying. And so that, when you're writing fiction and you have a paragraph to describe a room, I understand what a luxury that is.
What about thereafter when you applied to and were accepted at Columbia University's legendary School of Journalism to earn your master's degree?
It was kind of on a lark that I applied. I just thought, this acting thing, I don't know how long this is going to last as you get older, especially as a woman. And so I kind of applied thinking, well, that could be interesting, and got in. And it was a really tough course. It's only a year, but it's just jam packed, and you are just swamped with classes and professors and assignments. And the main thing about that was it taught me to go out in the world and ask questions. And one of the first things they do the very first day is they assign you a story and tell you to go out on the street and interview strangers. And you're terrified because, but after a while, you really get used to it. And so writing historical fiction requires so much research. And yes, you can do it all online if you want, but going out and finding the experts who've written the books, who've been to the buildings, who architecturers or architectural historians who've really know their stuff, take them out to lunch, and you get these gems of stories that aren't in books and aren't online. And that's the main thing it taught me. And I think that's what helps in terms of writing my books and making them come alive, is I have these real world sources that I can tap into. And I'm not afraid to ask them questions and then call them back and ask them more questions.
Within your debut novel, The Dollhouse, you introduced readers to what will become a signature throughout your catalog to follow. One InStyle.com highlights here is set in the 1950s against the glitzy backdrop of NYC's Barbizon Hotel, where a fleet of women stay to pursue careers as models, secretaries, and the like. This suspenseful novel about a woman who took a decidedly different path, and the journalist who wants to uncover her secrets will quicken your pulse. While the New York Post praised it as an ode to old New York that will have you yelling for more seasons of Mad Men. Is it true that you first discovered this building while hunting for an apartment personally?
I had written, I think, a kind of a really bad mystery, and I'd written a screenplay, which were both in a drawer and should be. But again, that's where you learn how to complete something, which is an important step in writing a book. And what happened was I was looking for an apartment in New York City, and my broker took me to the Barbizon 63 condo. And that's what it's called these days. It's been completely refurnished. And what it was in the past, though, was the Barbizon Hotel for Women. And it was this place where cultured young ladies could come and stay and be safe while they worked or studied in New York City. And you had people like Joan Didion, Grace Kelly, Lauren Bacall. The list is incredible of the renowned women who stayed there as young women. And it was a place where men weren't allowed above the first floor, although I learned through my interviews that they snuck them up all the time. It was run by a woman who, had to keep all these girls in line, and it had a library and a solarium and a gym and a, squash courts. It was just this incredible miniature city, really, for women. And what I learned when I was there was that, the journalist in me is always looking for stories. And so when I was there, I learned that when it went condo, there were a dozen of the old time residents still living there. These women who'd lived there for decades, back when, you couldn't wear pants to cross the lobby. You had to be in a skirt. And they were still living there in their 80s and 90s as they built these luxury condos. And so they were on the fourth floor paying $240 a month for a studio with a kitchenette. Meanwhile, the Penthouse went for $17 million. And so I was thinking, what a great story. These would be interesting women to interview, but they're very private. And it's one of those stories that I just couldn't shake. And I was thinking, I'd love to read a book that was set there. Wouldn't that be great? And that led me to, well, maybe I could write a book, because then I don't have to stick to all the journalism rules, right? I can make up characters, make up dialogue, which to be honest was terrifying. But it was just such a fun idea. I couldn't shake it. And so that's where that came from. That's where the first book came out of. And it took a long time to work on, because I really didn't know what I was doing.
Did you interview these women?
Eventually, like I said, they're very private. Eventually, I got to interview one who's kind of the head boss down there, and she was amazing. She'd been a journalist. She had great stories. She ended up coming to the launch party, which was such an honor. For me, it was like having Bruce Springsteen walk through the door, because I felt like I'd studied the situation and the setup and, what it was like for them. And she liked the book, thank goodness. So that was a real relief. I love stories with dual timelines and an element of mystery that really drives the story forward. So you're just turning the pages. And I thought, well, that's the kind of book I'll write. But if I had any idea how hard it is to write a dual timeline novel with a mystery, because if you screw something up in one timeline, you give away a clue too early or too late, and it just messes with the whole reveal. And that was a real learning curve for me, and a complete headache to try and make that work, because I did plot it out beforehand, just the way I would with a journalistic piece. I would do all the interviews, do all the research, and then come up with an outline of how I'll write this story. And I thought, okay, I'll do that here. But you have two timelines, you have dozens of characters, and then you have this mystery that you need to solve in a way that is hopefully really satisfying and yet surprising for the reader. And so, yeah, it was pulling together, things from theater. Okay, how can I twist this to, make the scene really pop so that the clue is tucked away and hidden. And so only later will the reader realize it was there the whole time. And then, in terms of journalism, structuring it so that it was solid. In terms of the costumes and the hairstyles and that kind of thing, when I was acting, we did this, a series of one acts by Thornton Wilder. And it was a group of us, and it was a theater company, and we did it. And, someone had to pull together the costumes. So my friend Dee Dee and I went to thrift stores and found costumes that fit that was kind of 1930s was the setting. And so we just went to thrift stores, found costumes, but that play ended up moving to Broadway and getting nominated for a Tony. And so Dee Dee and I both have costume design credits for Broadway, which is so ridiculous because, we basically bought things at thrift stores and then sewed them up to fix them. But it was great. And so that helped me kind of understand different periods of time and how important it is to get the silhouette right and that kind of thing. And that definitely helped when I was working and researching the 1950s, which is such an interesting time period, especially for women's fashions. And the cover, I think, just, was perfect. It's actually, the cover is from a Vogue photo shoot that they took one of the women and placed her in front of the Barbizon Hotel.
It must have been exhilarating both to land an agent and then to see that hotel on the cover of the finished book eventually in bookstores in New York.
I was in my mid-40s when I started writing this book. And I started going to different conferences, writers' conferences, just to learn what I didn't know about the industry, because I didn't know anything. It's not like journalism and publishing are the same. They're really different, especially with fiction. And so I was going out and listening to agents talk, and I remember hearing a panel, and there was an agent on it who said she was looking for strong female characters. And so when it was time to get this book and send it out, I sent it to her. And I explained, I saw you speak, here's what you said, here's my book, this is why I think we might be a good fit. And about 3 months later, she reached out and said, I love this book. It needs a lot of work, which it certainly did. And, I have a great title for you. And if you want to sign with me, I'll tell you the title. And I said, sure. And she was great because she was kind of new to agenting. She'd been a lawyer at at the agency for a long time doing contracts. And I was one of her first acquisitions. And so she was hungry and she had something to prove. And we worked on it together. And I actually worked with a freelance editor on it as well, because again, it needed work. I needed to fill in the blanks more. It was pretty bare bones. And then we sent it out to editors, and Dutton preempted it, which was really lovely. And I've been with them ever since as a publisher, and it's just been a dream ride. It's been great. You know, I've lived on the Upper West Side of New York for a long time now, and there's indie bookstores up there. And you know, I remember going into the Barnes and Noble, and there it was, and I you know, I was just so excited and a little teary. And a woman came by and she said, "Oh, are you okay?" And I was like, "Oh no, this is my book." And she went and bought it. And so I thought, okay, this is going really well. It was really wonderful. And you know, every time it hasn't changed. You know, I'm working on my 7th book now. And when the Magnolia Palace, which was my last book, came out, you get this box of books from the publisher. And it's just so exciting to see the cover and, you know, the jacket and the pages. It's every time it's a dream.
We look forward to airing Fiona's episode in full in an upcoming season on the streaming network, but for now we're excited to talk with her about her latest release. Now, you walk readers back in time and inside the Magnolia Palace in one of your latest bestsellers, where the Historical Novel Society found that the pages breeze by as potential romances develop, maybe not the ones you'd expect, and a mystery involving the whereabouts of the Magnolia Diamond unfolds. Deeper issues also undergird both narratives, which confront stereotypes about models and explore how a tragedy can warp family relationships years later. The two narratives dovetail in a satisfying way. Mystery and art lovers should relish this exciting escape into New York's past. And as with your other stories, did the building come before the characters in the course of its writing?
Yeah, it was. The building came first. And I love the Frick collection. It's this kind of a gem of a museum. It's not as big as the Met or the Guggenheim. It's just this intimate, well, it's a mansion, but you know, it's where the Fricks lived, and it's really frozen in time with the same furnishings and rugs and all these paintings on the walls, because Frick was such a great art collector. And so you walk around and, you know, there are 34 Vermeers in the world, and 3 of them are at the Frick. And you can get right up close and really look at them and see the brush strokes, because you're in someone's home. And so I thought it'd be great, because I love the way buildings have changed over time, as I've said. And so the fact that it was a Gilded Age mansion and a residence for a family of 3, served by a staff of 27, of course. And then later in the 60s, which is the other timeline, it's become a museum. And so I can kind of play around with how it's changed and how the people who walk through it have changed. I knew there'd be a missing diamond known as the Magnolia Diamond, this pink diamond. And I wanted a way to bring the artwork into the story without making it feel like an art education course. And so I came up with the idea of doing this scavenger hunt that starts in 1919 and actually ends in the 60s. As you know, what happens is the characters in the 1919, it's set up as a way of to woo someone, a courtship. And so all these clues are hidden within the artwork and behind the artwork in the house. And later, a fashion model who's come for a Vogue photo shoot that goes terribly wrong gets trapped inside during a snowstorm in the 60s, along with one of the junior curators, an intern. And together they stumble upon these clues and have to solve the scavenger hunt. And so that was really fun, because it was a way of exploring this building, imagining it dark, and you're the only people in it, you know, and you're trying to find this very, very valuable diamond. And so to me, that was a lot of fun of the research of the artwork and what these paintings meant. I was really terrified about doing it and very intimidated, because I don't have an art history degree, and the people who do, you know their stuff and will let you know if you got it wrong. But luckily the Frick has a great website where you can go into any room and click on the artwork virtually, and it comes up with a great description. So I could find things like, okay, the woman who sat for this portrait in the 1800s was the muse to this very famous political guy. And, you know, and here are all these women being looked at and painted, but who were they really? And what were their lives like? And that's where the story gets deeper, because it's 2 models, one an artist's muse for statues in 1919, who's kind of hiding out at the Frick mansion after getting caught up in a scandal. And then you have this fashion model in the 60s. And so it really becomes the question of, okay, what's the difference between being looked at and really being seen? And so being able to explore it that way through the artwork, through the characters, through Helen Frick, and the Frick family was an exciting ride. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed writing that one.
This was an instant New York Times bestseller, and we're curious for the aspiring author watching. When you head into a new novel's writing and release these days, is it more daunting or freeing to be a successful author?
It's a little bit of both. That's such a great question. And one thing that helps is that when I got my first success or my first book deal, I wasn't in my 20s. And I'm so glad that I was in my late 40s because I had more to say in the book. So when I had to write a second one, I thought, oh, well, I'll do this time because I lived through things and had, life experiences. And also it just puts things in perspective when you're a little older. It's not the end of the world. If no one likes your book, you will survive. But I've been lucky. I've been really supported by the team at Dutton, who have been fantastic, and my agent. But each book, I don't want to write the same book over and over. And so, for example, the Chelsea Girls had a different kind of narration. It wasn't jumping back and forth in time. It was a different structure. And then for the Frick, I thought, no one knows this building. It's not a well-known museum. And am I taking a huge risk in not doing something that's, the Empire State Building or something like that? And I'm so glad I did it because it introduced all these readers to the Frick who might not have known about it. And B, it was just the right thing to write. And I find if I go with my gut, I'm okay. And so the book I'm working on now, which is set at Radio City Music Hall, which is good fun. It's a Rockette in the 1950s. And that's going to be a bit of a thriller. And again, it's bookended by modern times, but the main crux of it is in the 1950s. And it's really interesting to write because it is a thriller. There's much more action. And to me, being able to kind of explore, new ways of writing. So I'm not just doing, 1880s, 1980s, it just breathes new life into every book. And I hope to be able to do that with every book. And, so far it's been a wonderful, wonderful time. But at some point, if I'm doing the gas station on the corner of 11th Avenue and it's not working, then I'll go off and do something else. That's perfectly fine too.
We understand your next novel takes readers right into New York City at Christmas time and Radio City Music Hall. We'd appreciate any sort of sneak preview you can give viewers.
Right now, it's the Spectacular. So that's Radio City Spectacular, the Christmas Spectacular that they do. It's been great. Yeah, so it's kind of all October, November, December of 1956. And it's been really, really fun to work on. I'm curious to see what they come up for the cover. We'll see. It's slightly dark, so it's Christmas with a touch of darkness, which I like. And to be honest, when I really look at this book, it's pretty perky. But yeah, when you read the Great Noir, it's just about the voice and the characters and just a heaviness. Talking about people who've lived their lives, it feels like these are people who've lived their lives and been hurt and been damaged. And definitely one of the characters in the book has been damaged.
Do you find writing a damaged character to be one of the most challenging kind to create on the page?
Yeah. You even look at someone like Helen Frick was definitely damaged from what happened in her past, in her childhood, the way her relationship with her father grew. And that to me is really interesting, is people who are showing one thing to the world, but inside feeling another. And that can be a great character to play with.
As you keep enchanting readers with new historical fiction originals, what can they look forward to diving into next?
Yeah, what the most recent thing that happened was I had a short story come out. It's a compilation of historical fiction authors by Amazon. And it's a short story called To a Wild Rose. It's called A Wild Rose, and it's actually a concert pianist at Carnegie Hall who, and she's having trouble with the two fingers of her hand. She can't play. And she gets pulled up to the top of the building where there's 170 artist studios that were built soon after Carnegie Hall was finished for artists and photographers and musicians and dancers. And she kind of ends up there with this crazy warren of artists. and kind of figures out her way with the help of them. And that was really, really fun to research and write. And that's available now on Amazon and Audible.
Every successful writer's career is based on foundational tenets that they've stuck with process-wise throughout their catalog. What are a few that have served you well that you'd share here with the aspiring author?
Yeah, I think the main thing when you're working on, especially on that first book, is to get through it. Because for every book, there's a point about 70% of the way through where you think it's not working. What's the point? I should just throw it out the window. And it's a false depression in a way. And if you can keep through that and get through it and work through and get to the end of the book, then you have something you can play with. But if you throw it out and turn to something else that's shiny and new, you'll never get that sense of completion and what it's like to write a really bad first draft and then rewrite it 10 times. And so that it finally shines. And that you just have to stick with it. And, Laura Linney said something about that when she's working on a role, right before tech week, which is always this harrowing week before it goes up, she just feels a complete loss and she hasn't figured out the character and it's not going to work. And it's just a matter of sticking through it and knowing that it'll work out if you stay with it.
Finally, before we go, what about working around the myth of writer's block?
I am right with you on that. If you don't turn in your copy by the deadline, you don't get paid. So there is no writer's block, right? You write something and then work with your editor to really make it sing. Or, you write a really, each day is different in the writing life. And so you can sit down, like yesterday I had a really good writing day. The scene just wrote itself pretty much. And that felt great. But I know today I'll sit down and everything will be stuck. That's what happens, but I know it'll change from day to day. So it's a matter of not getting caught up in the drama of it. You're just a work person. I studied piano for a long time when I was a kid, and that was just a matter of playing every day for an hour. And then suddenly you have chops.
Yeah.
And it's the same with writing. You just have to sit down and do it, not make it too precious. Don't worry about making the first sentence the perfect sentence. You can go back and do that.
Fiona, it's been absolutely fascinating talking today. Thank you so much for taking time to be on About the Authors TV.
Thanks again. This was just a blast.